This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by Audible. Stay tuned for a special offer at the end of the show. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Wednesday, December 23rd, 2020. We're almost at Christmas, and my guest is the wonderful Carolina Milanesi. Hi, Carol. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks. There's not a lot of news this week, but some stuff touches on some technologies that you have been covering as an analyst, and I'd love to kind of get your take on it. It's always a weird time of year with CS this year being virtual coming up. It doesn't feel quite right. Like at the same time, there's a lot of stuff coming. We know that. I think the schedules are going to change this year. Have you noticed that? I think that we're going to start seeing product launches in January and things like that.
Yeah. And press conferences at 5:00 for us. I'm not looking forward to.
Thank you, LG.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go. I'm sorry. I'm just going to keep an eye on what's going on after the fact. There's no way I'm doing a 5 a.m. press conference. That's ridiculous.
But did you also notice how interesting that the press conferences are all 30 minutes because, right, they don't have product demos. They don't have probably people, host and guests walking on to the stage. And so you get down to the nitty-gritty in 30 minutes and you're out. Yeah,
I mean, in a way, it's kind of nice. But I am completely at a loss to create a schedule for CS, even though, there are two things here. Part of it is I don't really care because if I can't get hands-on, for me, that's, unique content is what drives my CS. Making videos, I always make a couple of podcasts because I meet with people on site. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do about that. But at the same time, I'm going to cover the news on the show. But if I can't get YouTube content out of it, which I can't, it's less of an exciting thing for me. So I'm less keen. And at the same time, everybody's reaching out to me and telling me, hey, set up an appointment with us. And I'm like, where do I start? They're obviously like LG, a few things that we know when they're happening. Yeah. Like they were pushed upon us. And I kind of like it when they push things upon us because that's how my whole schedule at CS is run. It's like the big important things I can't move happen. And then I fill the gaps, right?
That's
and now
right.
I have no gaps to fill, so I don't know what to do.
It'll be interesting for sure, and also what this year will, how this year will change the CS to come, right? How different is going to be? Is it going to different at all, or are people just going to go back to what it used to be? Fascinating.
Yeah, and then with Mobile Congress being supposedly pushed to June, I've actually heard rumors that they're not going to do Barcelona, that it's going to just be Shanghai this year, and I'm not sure that's true. It's very possible, and it would be disappointing, but Barcelona in June sounds crazy because we're not going to be able to find lodging.
That's going to happen. Yeah.
Anyway, that's a little bit of inside baseball for all you folks on the show, but let's talk about some stuff that's happened this week. ZTE or ZTE, there's my Canadian coming out, launched a while back the Axon 25G in China, and it is now available as a global, or is coming soon as a global device. And so some of the YouTube creators in particular and other media got their hands on a device to play with. And the results are, yes, it does exactly what it says on the box. There's an in-display selfie camera, meaning it's under the screen. Now, Xiaomi and Oppo have shown this before, but it was really interesting to me that ZTE or ZTE was the first to just come out with a product. And the general take is that, well, it works, but it's like the selfie camera is pretty compromised in terms of performance, especially in terms of clarity. And you can clearly see like a little area of the screen looks slightly different when the pixels are fired up. So clearly this is very much a first gen and we were first coming out of the gate product.
Oh yeah, it's bragging rights, right?
What do you think generally of, this product, but maybe ZTE's strategy here, and or more importantly, like where are we going with this? Do you think this is a viable thing? Is that what people want?
I was thinking about this in terms of audience, right? So from a technology perspective, there's no question that this is about getting the brand noticed more and getting those bragging rights to be the first to bring something to market. But then there's two, in my opinion, interesting points. One is the compromise that a solution like this brings to the camera, and the if you like, the plus side, if you are more of the content person, and therefore, aesthetically you want to see the full screen, even if, to your point, the screen is still slightly compromised, because of being different to let the camera come through. But the other question is also the price point of the device, which is fairly aggressive, right? Are people that are spending $500-$600, which are normally people that are a little bit more careful about how they spend their money, they're not technology first, do they really care about a technology like that? Or that is where you really want to position a high-end phone, which obviously high-end for ZTE versus Samsung or Apple is different, right?
Yeah.
It's trying to marry who your target market is with the features that matter, because people that are more budget constrained want proof technology. They want technologies that make a difference to them, first of all, and then that they're not going to be disappointed by. And the camera is especially with selfies, is such a crucial part of the phone experience that I'm not quite sure that people are going to jump on this device thinking that they might have that compromise when they're taking a selfie.
Oh, for sure. I mean, this is definitely first gen. And again, like, we want to be first out the gate. Snapdragon 765G, this is very much a mid-range. The price is around 450 euros. I guess that's about maybe less than 600 US, 550 US.
Yeah.
It's a very reasonably priced phone, but that's par for the course for a 765G with an OLED display. I think that my feeling is the same as yours. I'm actually surprised we haven't seen better selfie cameras, even in flagships. Like, I feel like, back in the day, remember when HTC did the HTC One I think it was, or whatever it was called? It was an HTC phone on AT&T for the US market that had the exact same camera front and back.
Oh, yes.
And it had autofocus, and I think it was a little wider lens in the front, or like there's slight differences, but overall they were similar and the sensors were identical. And I'm waiting for a Samsung or an Apple or a Huawei or Google even, although Google generally doesn't lead in this kind of stuff. They lead in terms of their software and their know-how.
Yeah,
but
it's more computational photography.
They don't lead in terms of creating the new features. And when they do, they're generally very weird, like Soli, right? But I think that if any of these three are listening, I think this is something we need. I think we need a flagship where the front camera is uncompromised. It's like a 12 megapixel autofocus, and I know it's hard to do because obviously punch hole or hole punch has been the way lately. And then before that, notch, and Apple's still at the notch, and they're trying to reduce the size of the notch, and putting a real camera there is not going to reduce the size of the notch. This brings us to obviously this under display, in display camera system. And I think that that's the challenge. So I don't know. I feel like going forward, we're going to see more phones with this technology. There's going to be in-display fingerprint sensors, the optical ones.
That's right.
Came only 2 years ago, and they're everywhere now, and they're good now, and they're essentially cameras under the screen taking a photo of your fingerprint. Now, Samsung uses ultrasonics, like the Qualcomm technology, and we don't know what Apple's going to use on their next iPhone. We hear strong rumors there'll be a fingerprint sensor somewhere on their iPhones because COVID is still going to be with us for a while, and yeah. So I think for me, seeing the evolution of the under display or in-display fingerprint sensor, I think this could evolve very rapidly to at least match a baseline of selfie camera performance. But right now, it's definitely not there, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I wonder also if you're thinking about multi-camera system at the at the front of the screen, if that will help with that solution too, where maybe you're able to keep the notch limited because one of your two cameras is under the screen. I don't know if it makes sense to have both, or from a cost perspective, if you can do two.
Right.
I'm not sure how much room it needs to be between the two cameras, but with AR being more on people's radar going forward, I think that we're gonna see more attention to that front-facing camera than we had in the past. And I agree with you. It is more complicated, and maybe the rear camera, which is what people use the most anyhow, is where they focus because it was an easier sell than not trying. There's a generational gap as well, if you like, of who's using selfie cameras more than others. And so you tend to do general market first and then go to focus on our solution. But I agree with you. I think it's just a matter of time. But again, I would stress that maybe going into that higher end device first will pay better dividend than not trying and do a more mid-tier range device.
I think what's going to be interesting is the computational photography aspects behind this technology. I don't think you'll ever be able to get the same optical and performance out of this setup, right? Like, because you have to go through a screen, which is an array of pixels, which are not fully transparent. So, of course, it needs to happen. It can only happen on OLED, just like in-display fingerprint. But I think that the holy grail will be once, Google or Huawei or Apple develop algorithms that can fix what we're seeing in this camera. If you go to the article that I put in the show notes here, that's from The Verge, you can see Sam Byford taking photos of himself, and I hate to say this, it's so cliche, but it's night and day difference in quality between like just a Pixel 5 front-facing camera and the Axon, this ZTE phone. So I think that there's a lot of performance issues still need to be fixed. And I think computational photography can fix it. I think that this is the kind of stuff where, and this is why I brought up Google in my initial thing, that is saying, like, I wish one of those four would really focus on the selfie camera, because, well, if Google took their computational know-how and tried to fix this problem, I have a feeling they would do it pretty rapidly. So I think it's coming. I understand why they did a mid-ranger with this, because it's not good enough to be in a flagship. Right?
Yeah.
And I also understand, as you said, like the notch and hole punch sizes need to stay small, so the flagships can't focus on having the best selfie camera. But conversely, like even a phone like the Razr 5G that finally has a decent main camera, that 48 megapixel with OIS. One of the better cameras that Moto's given us, honestly, lately. The nice thing is, because it folds, you can take photos with the main camera.
Absolutely. I was about to say, actually, that maybe one of the solutions would be moving to foldable, because that gives you more flexibility on using the main camera as a selfie camera. Absolutely. Yeah. Obviously, it'll be a while before foldable is a mass market. Yeah,
totally. And I think alternative form factors, we're going to talk about more of them later in the show. I think those might be the solution in a way to this selfie. Like, we might not need a selfie camera anymore, or maybe just a secondary one, like the Galaxy Z Flip has. Like, they have a camera in the front, in the display, and a hole punch just for video calls, just for the non-important stuff. But then if you want to take a selfie shot, you can do it with the main camera, and it's just a much better experience for everyone, especially the folks that, I think it's not just younger people. I think a lot of people want good selfies now. And I think that even flagships don't quite deliver there, in my opinion, compared to what's coming out of the main sensors these days. So,
but it's interesting that you mentioned, the less important stuff like video calls, because actually this year that played a big role. And our data shows that there were people working from home that relied more on their phone, because the camera on their phone was better than the camera on their PC. Yep. So if you're not set up like we are, with external cameras, and you have a PC that is more than a couple of years old, you're going to struggle. And a lot of people just went to their phones.
I think what I meant by less important is that when you're just casually taking a quick call with your phone, like I don't mean like if you sit down to take a conference call. A lot of people work remotely, but don't have to be in video calls. Like, a lot of people work remotely and they're on Slack all day, and every now and then they spend 5 minutes on a call. We are seeing a lot of that as journalists and analysts, because we are literally in briefings that are video briefings for hours on end. And so, you and I are talking heads on various video shows. And so we have to have a good audio and video setup, right? But I think for the average person, especially younger people who might be working in the service industry and still having to deal with going to work every day, they just flip their phone open and do a FaceTime, And for that, I think you can get away with a slightly lesser camera for a few minutes. I mean, ultimately, I want every camera on every phone to be great. And we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Don't we all?
With all the proliferation of cameras. OnePlus, they showed us a concept like they did at CES in 2020, earlier this year, but they're kind of doing it ahead of CES, called the OnePlus 8T concept. And it is a color-changing device. The back panel changes colors based on, we're not quite sure what it's based on. Apparently, well, there's definitely a radar chip in there, like solely on Google, that detects your presence and can kind of adjust the color based on your proximity and whatever. But it, also I think they're using other cues to change the color, like, I guess like a mood stone or something.
Man, but, mine would be black.
Yeah, right.
For 2020.
But it's interesting. Look, it's a total gimmick, and I don't want to say this in a mean way, but I think exploring new technologies, phones that you can personalize. I worked with a startup that's gone now, that did an e-ink case that basically put an e-ink display on the back of your iPhone. So the case had an e-ink panel, and you could basically customize the way the back of your phone looked. And of course, put information there, like, if your phone was about to die, you could paste the Google Maps directions on the back, and you were going to make it to your destination and being able to plug in and charge. You could put your boarding passes back there if you flew and stuff. There's some cool things there. So I'm not against the innovation, but here it seems to be a single shape that just changes color, not an actual display.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see that OnePlus feels that this is like a thing, But at the same time, I don't want to negate the experimentations that's happening. I think that phones have been very boring for very long, and I think 2020 has finally shown us. One of the good things that came out of it is form factors. Like, they've matured. Folding phones are still expensive, but they work now. And, there's still lots room for improvement, right? But I also think that, the LG Wing was one of my favorite phones this year. And it's gimmicky. There's no way I would recommend. In my conclusion, I said, do not buy this phone. But if you're like me and you're tech savvy early adopter and you buy a new phone every 6 months, yes, buy this phone. Experience it. It's remarkable. It is fun. It is cool. It's different. People will be stunned when you flip it open in public. And yet the technology it uses is super proven. That's why it was affordable, relatively speaking. And so I think that gets me excited. Michael Fisher, Mr. Mobile, has an entire YouTube series about when phones were fun, where he's looking at a retrospective of older phones with weird form factors. And so I can't be mad at OnePlus for doing this, but at the same time, I don't ever think we're going to see a phone with this in the next, anytime soon, right?
But is the balance between the value and kind of a return of investment? So, Nokia has done a lot of things back in the day, and I've been talking to Michael about this because I don't know if I'm sure you do remember the lipstick phone.
Yes, absolutely.
I still have one of those in my cupboard.
Oh my God.
I have
That's wonderful.
One of the L'amour or La Fleur. I always confuse because Nokia did L'Amour, and then Samsung came out with La Fleur.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That had a suede back, which was amazing for about 5 days. And then it would get as dirty as... yeah. So, experimenting with the back of the phone more as an extension of who you are, and really to show off, because you as a user can't see the back, right? When you're using this thing, it's not like I'm going to see the OnePlus back change color. And in a way, I thought about, and this is going to sound terrible, but when you buy frozen yogurt and they give you the spoons that change color because of a temperature, right?
Yep,
that they're one color that is so cool. The first 5 seconds, and then you get into eating your frozen yogurt, and the spoon is either in your mouth or in your, so you don't see it. And I feel kind of the same way. And I know that phones have been boring. I agree with you. I also seen some really interesting stuff on glass that Corning being experimenting with, just a way of rendering color different. But all has, at the end of the day, a cost impact. And you need to weigh that with how much are consumers going to be willing to pay to then put the damn thing in a case.
Right, exactly.
Because that's the other part, right?
Yeah, totally. No, I visited the Corning Labs. There's some really cool stuff they're working on. And I think that, look, I embrace the experimentation here. But that's also it's a concept. We can't be, too judgy about that. It's just an interesting little side note. This is one of the cool things that came in my inbox this week and that I got basically ahead of time under embargo and I thought was cool. But, speaking of more tangible, like present day things, we have some Snapdragon 888 performance benchmarks that were released by Qualcomm. Normally, they fly us all somewhere. Last year, we actually did the performance benchmarks in Hawaii as part of the Snapdragon Summit. In the past, they have flown us to the headquarters or met us in various cities to actually let us use one of their developer devices to run our own benchmarks on, so we can all have our own screenshots and our own data. But obviously with COVID, they couldn't do that. So they sent us videos showing them running the benchmarks, like as legitimately as possible. And it, seems pretty legit. And the performance is definitely there. I mean, it seems like I've linked to the hot hardware analysis because I'm not a huge benchmarking person, even though I write for Hot Hardware most of their phone reviews and I have to do benchmarks. So I'm actually learning from having to do reviews. I just feel like benchmarks, as an engineer who worked in video games where performance is critical, I feel like benchmarks are very important. Like we run performance analysis on the video games that I was making back in the day, and I was a part of that process. So I understand the technology behind benchmarking and the need for it. But I feel that for a phone, for a device that's so personal, that's so versatile, that does so many things, it's not so much about the numbers on paper as the experience and how it feels, how fast it feels, which is one of the reasons that one of my top 5 phones for the year is the OnePlus Nord, because it felt no difference than a Snapdragon 865 phone, yet it was a Snapdragon 765 phone. It goes to show how optimizing software can go such a long way. So this just shows us that basically, according to the folks at Hot Hardware, my editor Dave, they're apparently big gains. They're seeing some really big improvements, possibly more than the switch between 855 to 865. And that's good news. And I think, honestly, I think it's needed because Apple's just been wiping the floor in terms of performance for years now, it seems like. And it just feels like Qualcomm's playing catch up, right?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I'm not a benchmarking person. And I also feel that they're there more for us in the industry than they're there for your general consumer, right? So it's about us and how we use them to then inform potential buyers. But with the phone, there are so many different aspects and inputs and just, from an environment perspective, how close you are to the network and, what kind of things you're doing. There's so many different variables, right, that make your experience that the benchmark sometimes goes out the window. That said, it is extremely encouraging, to your point, that, it doesn't feel like Qualcomm is playing catch up. And I feel that this is where we might see some of the conversation going into 2021 as far as, the chipset world and players and who's getting what chip in their phones, especially in the high end. And if Qualcomm can position itself as the best experience in 5G, I think that will make a big difference for them. Granted, it seems like competition is becoming less versus more in this area. But I think you need to think about beyond phones. So if you started to think about AC PCs and, right, connected PCs, that is where, this matters even more, especially now that we've had Apple with the M1 chip.
Yeah. We're going to have a conversation about how everybody's like weaponizing ARM for their own purposes. I guess that's maybe a bit of a a strong headline, but I always come up with these weird headlines, and I never like. That's one of the things I love about writing for Hot Hardware is that they always have to tone me down because like some of my headlines are just like ridiculous. But I do appreciate that. That's what a good editor does. So I'm looking quickly at these benchmarks as we're speaking because I didn't actually really look at them. But the big takeaway for me here is that we're seeing a huge improvement, like a doubling in performance on ML, AI, so machine learning, anything that's basically requires the neural processing cores. And that's honestly what is the most needed these days. Like a lot of the photography stuff we do, like segmentation, where it actually looks at the photos and says, I'm going to process the leaves and the tree differently from the sky, differently from the face in this portrait. That's all done through like and analyzing the photo and using machine learning algorithms to figure out what's the face, what's the tree, what's the sky. That is where you need the oomph. And, a lot of that is done through specialized basically processing units, and in the same way as GPUs are specialized for graphics and CPUs are general computing. And so obviously, you can, when you run like an machine learning algorithm, you use a little bit of everything. You might use some GPUs, some CPUs, some of the neural core stuff. But I think the numbers here are like, wow, like we're going from, like on the AI22, which is the AI benchmark from Antutu, we're going from like 130,000 or so points for 765 to 450,000 for 865. So that's what we had this year in 2020. So it's a big jump from the 765 to the 865. And then we're going from there doubling up to 910-ish thousand. So that's the big jump. And I think for games, that's going to be the most noticeable at first. And then eventually, like I think the ability to run multiple cameras simultaneously, all that is something that Qualcomm has discussed thoroughly with the introduction of the 888. So I think this is all there. I mean, look, I think it's interesting. I feel like I'm not going to like be super excited until I get myself a phone in my hand, but I like what I'm seeing, especially in light of what Apple has been doing, especially Apple with their neural cores. They're just killing it. Now, of course, it's hard to compare Apple and oranges, because, Carolina's laughing at me there. Because look, the reality is Apple's such an integrated ecosystem, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's like that's part of why the M1 is such a killer chip. It's not just that the hardware is fast. It's like the way they integrated the RAM into it, the way the SSD subsystem is optimized because they have their own controller, the way the software takes advantage of it, the fact that you can have now. I've been struggling with my 8 gigabytes Intel Max for the RAM and wanting to update to 16, and I have an 8 gigabyte M1 and it wipes the floor in terms of the number of tabs. Like I feel like I suddenly have 16 gigs of RAM when I only have 8. And you're going to say, well, that's not possible. But it is because, memory allocation is very inefficient on Intel chips. It always has been. When I was a developer making games, I was writing code simultaneously for PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. And always anything that was running Intel-based chips was always struggling with memory allocation performance. Like, like the original Xbox, for example, was an Intel-based system. Then they went to a PowerPC for the Xbox 360, right? Like they learned, they switched to a completely different architecture because they knew better, right?
But I think this is exactly the biggest problem that Qualcomm has in terms of getting the recognition that they deserve, is that they're dealing with a lot of different implementation of the technology that they have. So the experience on the same chip, the experience that you are going to have on a OnePlus with the experience that you're going to have on a Samsung device can be quite different. Because there are variables, but also because not every vendor decides to take advantage of everything that comes, with the architecture and the system that they deliver on their chip. And I think that's what I find frustrating, because there's so much goodness in the solutions that Qualcomm brings to market around cameras, around AI across the board. And the vendors just don't take advantage of that, either because they're trying to do something on top of it that is their own. But to your point, even just on the verticalization point, you also have to think about the different skins from a UI perspective, right? That the vendors put on top. That is something that makes them all a bit different. So it's not even that you're talking about one Android. And obviously the other big thing on the Android ecosystem is the version of Android that these phones are running, and what the chips get to be tested and optimized for versus what then is going to get into the market. That's a problem that Apple doesn't have, right?
Yep. And then there's the other problem that we had this year. Again, I only know this because at Hot Hardware, when I do a review, I have to do benchmarks, that Android 11 systematically benchmarks slower than Android 10 on the same hardware. So the Pixel 4a, which launched with Android 10, when it got its Android 11 update, was slightly slow on benchmarks. It didn't feel worse. It didn't behave differently. But all of a sudden, the benchmarks were telling us it's performing less. And we were all scratching our heads. And it turns out that, it's just the way the benchmarks are run and the way the software is optimized. It has nothing to do with the actual performance of the chip. It hasn't changed.
Right.
So, that's that opens a can of worms. Of course, Apple could be subject to this as well from one version of iOS to another. So, but we've never seen that level of variability before. So, So Snapdragon 888, turns out that the first phone with it might be, or very strongly rumored to launch on December 28th, December 29th, is going to be the Xiaomi Mi 11 series. There's going to be a few phones, like usually they're going to be a Lite, a Pro, maybe an Ultra, but we don't know anything much about them other than Xiaomi is going to be first out the gate and they're going to do it in 2020 somehow, or at least announce it. I don't think we're going to see these phones in person for sale until later, especially since we're in the US. But the Mi 10 series last year was a pretty damn solid series, and I expect good things here. I think Xiaomi's always kind of been one of the first to adopt Qualcomm chips. I have a couple of phones here with chips from Qualcomm in Xiaomi phones that are not yet even available on any other phone that came out in the fall. The Poco X3 NFC has a Snapdragon 732, which still is on no other phone that I know of, and that chip was announced, I don't know, early September or something. And then the Snapdragon 750, the 5G chip, that's a little lesser than the 765. We've seen the Mi 10T Lite, which I also have, which has that chip in it. But we have yet to see a Snapdragon 768 chip device. That's one of the few chips that Qualcomm has announced. It's a 5G chip that's better than the 765. We haven't seen that chip on any phone yet, and Xiaomi's always seems to be the first out of the gate with anything. They were the first 720 chip out. It's crazy. So not surprising that they'll be the first with an 888,
It's quite interesting to see this shift towards Qualcomm. Not surprising from a quality perspective. It makes a lot of sense. But, you start to think about how much is... if you're specifically looking at Qualcomm versus MediaTek, and how MediaTek was for a few years the kind of the golden child for mid-tier and Chinese vendors and those brands that were trying to get more volume, broader reach, and now there is this shift towards Qualcomm, and I think that is part of it is 5G. And obviously how much R&D spent Qualcomm has had there. But I also think that part of the reason is what we were discussing earlier as far as camera and AI capabilities that Qualcomm has also spent a lot of time developing, because it takes away from the effort that the brands themselves have to put into these devices. And this has become a much more critical part of the experience that consumers have. Clearly, MediaTek is still doing well from a sales perspective. They are in a lot of other devices, if you're thinking more broadly, and they basically control the Amazon market space, right?
Yeah, and that's a huge thing right now, right?
So there's not a question of quality, but I think it's just a question of focus and what Qualcomm was able to do.
For sure, yeah. So let's see what happens there. I've been pretty excited to see, get my hands obviously on a flagship device again. There are two things that come out of this discussion for me. The first one is I'm hoping we see a 700 series update this year from Qualcomm, because I feel that that's the chip of the year maybe the M1 is the chip of the year in my opinion, but the M1 is not a phone chip. So
That's right.
Phone chip of the year to me is a Snapdragon 765G. I think that they nailed it with that chip. It is the perfect balance of everything you need: price, performance, 5G, battery life. It's using 7 nanometers, so it's actually a pretty efficient chip. All of that. I think they killed it with that chip.
Yeah,
and,
especially considering what it enables, right, from an experience and price
Totally.
point perspective.
It's made an entire new ecosystem of $500 phones possible that just didn't exist. But related to that, I want to give kudos to MediaTek this year because for the first time, I feel they're hot on the heels of Qualcomm. I played with the LG Velvet for T-Mobile, which is a MediaTek 1000C, Dimensity 1000C, and that chip is better in machine learning and AI performance than the 765G when you run benchmarks. It feels the same. It's a little slower in terms of everything else, but not by much. But the one chip that really surprised me in terms of like the feel of the device using it was the Realme 7 5G, which I recently reviewed. My review is finally up on Hot Hardware. Check it out. That phone is a $350 roughly phone if you convert it from abroad. And it is a 5G phone. Basically competes with the OnePlus N10 5G. And it beats it in every way. It's funny because it's both BBK group, yet Realme is just completely obliterating, in this case, obliterating the Snapdragon 690, right? And almost reaching 765G levels of performance with the Dimensity 800U. And with optimized software, this phone just flies. Carolina, I couldn't believe it. I was like, this felt like a Nord, like the original Nord, which is really fast. And I was like, why did OnePlus even make the N10 5G with all its compromises when, its neighbor next door at Realme is completely like blowing it out the door with this Realme 7 5G? And I think a lot of it has to do with MediaTek here because the price difference on that chip is probably what makes the price difference possible on this phone.
Possible on the device,
and they were able to bump up the specs in other areas where it's better than the Nord N10 5G because of it. Right. So that's something to keep an eye on. I think MediaTek's going to surprise us this year with possibly a chip that finally plays with the big boys.
Well, the question is going to be, can they get into more of an LG than in the US, right? Because we are so, like, I feel like a kid looking inside a candy store, but not being allowed in, right? Because there's so much that is going on in Asia that we never going to see in the US.
Yep. That's why I'm reviewing a lot of phones from Asia when I can, because even though, like Hot Hardware's audience is US based, but still like people need to know
what's possible, what's out there,
what's available, what's possible, what they're missing out on.
Absolutely.
And maybe it widens their horizons enough to say, you know what? Like I'm in a urban center that has all the 4G bands and I don't need the very specific 600 megahertz band on T-Mobile because I'm not living in a rural part. So I'm going to buy this phone because it really fits my needs. And maybe we see more adventure happening from the tech savvy folks that are maybe a little less tech savvy than, the super hardcore audience I have here on the podcast. But so another thing that came along to me, we're talking about like, multiple cameras and machine learning and, the importance of computational photography. Samsung leaks are coming left, right, and center about the S21 series lately. The latest this week, and I usually don't cover leaks too much until it becomes really obvious that this is coming very soon and that it's very baked, right? Like very close to what we're going to see. The latest is that there's a bunch of like full color images of the phones leaked of at least the S21 and the Ultra. The Ultra, though, surprised everyone with 6 cameras. I think 5 on the back, 1 in the front. I'm not sure if there's 6 in the back because I only see 5. But I mean, again, this doesn't surprise me too much in the sense that we've seen, the Ultra, the Note 20 Ultra, which has, at least 4 cameras in the back.
Yeah.
And they're good. Not like just adding some 2 megapixel macro stupid camera. Like I call them sticker cameras. Not just adding sticker cameras here, which the BBK group is very good at doing, but actually like genuine, bona fide, usable cameras. obviously the flagships are never going to put sticker cameras on. They're going to, I think, going to have these cameras genuinely for a purpose because they can afford to put them in there and properly use them and leverage them. And with chips like the 888 and whatever new Exynos chip is coming, they're going to be able to actually like use them simultaneously or whatever. But do you think that we're going to see a balance, an equilibrium in terms of this madness of proliferation of cameras, especially at the mid-range? I'm a little concerned when I see phones that have two megapixel, completely useless 2 megapixel sensors that you're never going to use, and sacrifice the cost of those versus putting a slightly better main sensor. Like the Pixel 4a is a perfect example. Single camera in the back, but what a single camera it is, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that this is a discussion. It's like going back to the beginning when we were talking about megapixels, right? And I feel that megapixel discussion has become now number of cameras, and the more is not necessarily the better, right? There's a lot that you can do from a software perspective, from an AI perspective to deliver better shot. I think it depends a little bit what kind of photographer you are, right? If you are somebody who cares about the shot versus taking the picture. And so if you maybe prefer to mess around with the cameras that you have and spend time setting them up and, and recognizing the difference between sticker cameras or not, then the question becomes, the more could be, the better. But most consumers are not like that. They care about the shot. And so the way that shot is delivered, it doesn't necessarily depend on how many cameras you have. There's a mix between the camera, what kind of camera, and then the software side, right? So I think there's different ways of delivering that better experience. I also feel that, aesthetically, more cameras don't make necessarily for a prettier phone.
Yeah, totally.
And then they also might end up compromising, how sturdy these devices are in terms of, if you have an area with more cameras together, if you drop it, that might be more of a liability. So there are a lot of things to take into account, but I totally agree with you with the, is the quality of the camera that you add. It's not just that you add another camera.
Right. And I'm looking at this a little more while we were talking. I think that obviously one of the sensors is for depth. It's sort of like, looks like a laser autofocus, but more than laser, like actual, like some sort of like time of flight sensor setup. And that's, obviously not a camera you can leverage directly, but you're going to benefit from it for things like depth and portraits and other things like that. And of course, they're doing what Huawei did on the P40 Pro Plus, which having two telephotos, a 3X and a 10X optical X's here. So 3X is just a regular 3X telephoto, and then the 10X is a folded lens like on the P40 Pro Plus. And honestly, I've been reviewing the P40 Pro Plus. Well, I've had it since July, but I'm writing a review right now for Gear Diary. So stay tuned for that, folks. But what I'm saying to you is that this is still my favorite camera phone of the year. Like, to me, it's a toss between the Note 20 Ultra, which I feel has one of the best 5x periscope zooms ever. But you have a bit of a gap between that main sensor having to zoom in software all the way to 5x before 5x can take over. But the 5x is really solid. And so I think that filling the gap with a 3 in the middle like that, and then having a 10x for real optical zoom madness is the way to go. And, obviously Huawei was the first to do it. And I'm glad to see that Samsung's following suit. So don't let the 6 camera thing, phase you too much. There's clearly not 2 cameras in the front or anything like that. And even the P40 Pro Plus that looks like it has 2 cameras in the front because there's an oval cutout. That second camera in the front is actually Face ID. Like it's like a time of flight dot array, just like what Apple's using on Face ID, Face Unlock. So that you can't use that sensor again. I think that the S20 series is a really solid, obviously a really solid series, but I felt that the S20 Ultra missed the boat a bit. Too expensive, too bulky, too ugly, Camera's not 100% sorted, but I feel that the Note 20 Ultra really fixed all that. And I'm really hoping that this year with the S21, they nail the S21. Like that the S21 Ultra comes out the door being the camera phone we look up to until Huawei does the P50, at least, And of course there's Apple. And The Verge declared the iPhone 12 Pro Max the best camera phone this year. And I think they're so completely wrong. Like, it's a great camera phone. The cameras on Apple phones are fantastic. But you cannot, with a 2.5x, optical zoom, touch what Huawei and Samsung are doing with folded lenses. Like Apple needs a folded lens.
It's interesting to me, though, that when you're looking at the technology in that way, you start to look at how many people take advantage of what. And I agree with you with where Samsung is, because I think that Samsung is kind of in between where Apple and where Huawei is, right?
Yes.
I think Huawei is starting to be too niche. I mean, it's a great experience, but I don't know how many people would be prepared, to spend the money and see the value, right? That doesn't mean that there's no reason to get excited. They do have an incredible technology that they use for a long time. The other part, I think, is usability, right? And so is the UI around the camera and the features and how easy it is to find what you're looking for. And I think that that's where, on the Apple side is all very simple to do. Samsung is getting better every year. I think that last year their camera UI got way better than it used to be. I'm still struggling a little bit with Huawei, and I think the last one that I reviewed was the P30, so I'm way behind you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's been improvement there. But it's the combination of all of that, right? It's the technology, and then there's the usability of that function.
Absolutely. No, I think Huawei's out of the game here in terms of, for us, we don't have GMS now. We can't run our Google apps. It's
right.
But as a mobile photographer, I have to look at it like just the camera
absolutely.
stuff, right? But I think that's why, to me, if you had to tell me for 2020 what's the camera phone, if you're just looking at the cameras, it's the P40 Pro Plus. If you're looking at a whole well-rounded package, it's the Note 20 Ultra, no doubt about it.
That's one of my two favorite phones for the year.
The other one I think that competes well with the Note 20 Ultra is the Oppo Find X2 Pro. It has a phenomenal camera system, and it's a very well-rounded phone. But of course, it's Asia only, and it has one Achilles heel, which I think this is where Samsung always nails things, and the other manufacturers, especially BBK Group, always seem to struggle, is no wireless charging. This is a $1,200 phone that doesn't have wireless charging. Yet, if they have wireless charging on the OnePlus 8 Pro and they have wireless charging on some other Oppo phones, it's just like, it seems to me like BBK Group needs to wrap their heads around the fact that Samsung's putting wireless charging on everything that's $500 or more, basically. And they need to start doing that too. Like, remove one of those stupid sticker cameras and give us wireless charging. It's just crazy to me that they're not on board with that. But we spoke about crazy form factors earlier. And, there's been lots of rumors that the next phone from LG, as part of their Explorer program, which the LG Wing was a part of, the first initial phone, which is basically LG's attempt at, in a way, and I don't mean that in a negative, like, I'm not trying to be snarky here, but LG's attempt at becoming more relevant again, because LG has a history of innovation. I love their products, and I've been very bummed by the very ho-hum kind of Me Too, very generic phone devices.
Right there with you.
And so seeing this Explorer project is exciting, which is why the LG Wing was exciting. And there's this rumor for a while now of a rollable phone that basically can be pulled on each side to stretch into a bigger screen, called the LG Slide, potentially named that. And there are more leaks today and rumors, specs and pricing. You were looking at $2,359 US. And honestly, I'm not surprised. This is even way more complicated than a folding phone,
Absolutely.
Right? So what's your take on this? Like, I think this is going to be very first gen and tons of problems, and they're going to just be able to do it to show that they can do it. I don't think it's going to be viable. Like, I think the Wing is a viable product to some extent. It's gimmicky, but you can count on it as a solid phone.
Yeah, but
right?
the Wing you said earlier, it's like it was proven technology from a screen perspective, from a display point of view. You weren't playing with something that was soft. You had, in a way, even if you think about, we've been doing this job for a long time, right? Swivel phones that you had in the past
yes.
is very similar in concept. It's just that before you had it between the keyboard and the screen because screens were more expensive 10 years ago, right?
Right.
But the idea is no different, right?
Correct.
Here, you're talking about something that is going to have to be even softer than what you have in a foldable phone today.
Mm-hmm.
And we know how much care you need to use for those devices, right? And the things that you can't do with those devices as well, right? So from using a pen to the quality of the actual picture and all of it. So this is another bragging rights for me moment. It's great, and is they have a foldable TV, so it also kind of makes sense that they have a lot of technology that they can leverage, and is for me is always exciting when you have a brand that looks broadly at their portfolio and leverage technology across devices and see the opportunity. But it's going to be a while before this becomes viable at a price point that also is not niche.
Yeah, no, I think for sure. I'm just excited about it because if they somehow are able to make this not as janky as the original Fold was, like not come out with such a disastrous launch and actually come out with something that there's a lot of caveats and a lot of care needed, but it works and it's there and it's a showcase because they're not unlike Samsung, who went like, we're making the first folding phone, and then they got their lunch eaten by L'Oreal at CES. It was really funny. I think LG is possibly going to be able to say, look, this is part of this Explorer project. Like, people are immediately going to cut them slack for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Immediately, the optics are different, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, so as long as this thing isn't completely like breaks in the first week, like the original Fold media devices did, then I think I'm okay with $2,359. This is not a phone people are going to buy in mass ever.
Yeah,
right?
It's not what you're going to buy if you're looking for a phone.
Yeah,
That's
even
right.
the LG Wing is not a phone people are going to buy because I told them not to, right? Like,
and they better listen.
But the thing is, LG, I think it's like, you build a Halo car, people buy the cheaper cars, right?
Yes.
And I think that's kind of where I think there is a lot to be said there. If LG can take all the money they make from televisions and washing machines and fridges and put that into the mobile division, which is hurting, and show us some Halo devices, it doesn't mean that the mobile division is going to become profitable, but at least it puts them in a better position. Like, if you look at the Wing and you don't buy it because you're like, that's too much money for me, or, too gimmicky, you're going to look at the Velvet next, because now you have the awareness of the LG brand, and the Velvet looks very similar. In fact, it's the exact same front screen other than the teardrop notch. So, you might end up with a Velvet in your pocket, and that's kudos to LG. The only thing I'm a little worried with LG is that they're still not delivering the best they can in their bread and butter, right? Like, I still want to see a real flagship from LG that competes with the S20 series or S21. I want to see a Velvet that's a little more competitive, like OIS on the main lens. LG is known for its photography chops. They put OIS on the lens of the Wing because it's a $1,000 phone. But like, why cut it out on the Velvet, which is your kind of killer price point, like $700 price point, right? And I know they're not in a place where they make a lot of money and they're wanting to cut costs, but the cutting costs is what's hurting them. If they could have delivered the LG Velvet with all its awesomeness, with a slightly better camera system, by doing little things like OIS or whatever, and have a telephoto on there, like, which they somehow no longer have on their phones, like, this would have been competitive maybe with the S20 Fan Edition, which is one of the most amazing for the money phone you can get this year. So it'll be interesting to see.
I think that they need a big cultural change, in my opinion. I think they're running the mobile division the same way that they run the white goods division, where, making little compromises to get to a better price point is actually an advantage.
Right.
And mobile is not the same, unfortunately.
No, and I think they're also picking the wrong priorities. Like, look at what Samsung did to get to the S20 FE price point. They put a plastic back on it. I don't like it. But I understand the compromise. They didn't take out wireless charging. They didn't take out the telephoto.
Absolutely.
They didn't take out the IP rating.
You don't take what makes the experience.
But what they did was they knew everybody's going to put that phone in a case.
Yep.
And so at that point, who cares if you have a plastic back, right? Like, it does bother me, but as I understand the compromise.
You're
that's
very
the right
demanding.
compromise. Of course, I'm demanding. Understatement of the decade. Microsoft is supposedly developing ARM chips of their own, just like Google is supposedly developing ARM chips of their own. That's the latest rumor that Microsoft is doing this. And honestly, after the crazy beating the M1 did to the Snapdragon 8CX version 2 and the whatever that chip is, SQ1 version 2 or whatever from Microsoft, I can understand why, but I'm like, it seems like too little too late. To me, explain this to me as an analyst, because Intel sold their X-Scale ARM division years ago, which we all knew at the time was a strategic mistake because the world was going to run on ARM. But I can understand that maybe back in those days when they were flush with cash, it didn't seem to make sense. But in the last at least 3 or 4 years, it's been very clear to me that if you are a chip maker of any kind, you need a solid ARM division, even if ARM isn't your mainstream. And so where is Intel there, first of all? But more importantly, why can't Qualcomm deliver the level of performance we saw from Apple, at least purely on the chip level? I'm not talking about the integration here, which is clearly an advantage with Rosetta 2 and all that Mac has. But just side-by-side benchmarks clearly show, and it's not just the software. I'm pretty sure Microsoft knows how to make software. So I'm like, why is it that Qualcomm is not? Is it because they're mobile first? But Apple came from mobile first.
Yeah, I think it's more from a Microsoft perspective, and the reason why I think Qualcomm, I don't know if they're going to do it entirely on their own. I think that we're going to see a step where the collaboration with Qualcomm might be tighter, and so see where they go from there, and maybe eventually they're going to go and do it on their own. But I think what is different is, as you said, one is the software and the chipset integration one. But the other one that is extremely different in what people are expecting and prepared to put up with in the Windows environment versus a Mac environment. So I always stated that Apple actually getting into delivering their own chips for Mac was a good thing for Microsoft. And I know it seems like an oxymoron, but it's not. And the reason is that, one, they need to figure out how to leverage the ecosystem that the M1 is going to enable from an app perspective. So, the kind of things that we've seen in emulation and with Rosetta 2, what are the learnings there that you can take on the Windows side so that when you get into an enterprise environment, you have a better experience? Because unfortunately, the problem, and I think that where you end up with, even if you think back at the reviews of the Surface X Pro, people compare that with a PC, right? So can I have the drivers here? Oh, can I do the printer? Oh, this really odd software that I use to do my expenses doesn't, run right. Apple doesn't have that burden, right? In an enterprise environment. If you have a Mac, you're already kind of an odd one out in an enterprise environment, and worked out how you work. Right. So I think that now we're at a point where, because of how the penetration of mobile is within enterprise and people know how to support mobile, if you can make that PC running on ARM an extension of your mobile fleet or your phone, smartphone fleet or tablet, you're changing the way that the IT is going to think about that. And so the question is, you having something that looks like a PC running and giving you an experience like your phone versus comparing an Intel PC to an ARM-based PC. And I think that is going to get people to think differently at the opportunity.
Yeah.
I also think that silicon diversity is going to be one of the biggest trends in 2021. And so AMD also comes into that discussion.
Well, of course. Yeah. No, I think for me, what's interesting here is that Microsoft is clearly not satisfied with Qualcomm. I mean, I don't want to say that because Qualcomm has to have something under their belt that they can't talk about right now, because if they don't, that's a problem at this point. That's Intel is clearly going to be fading over the next 5 years as the primary chip makers for Windows PCs. Definitely going to be gone from the Macs, and maybe AMD will take some of that, but I think that's not the only solution. I think ARM is shown its benefits with the M1.
Absolutely.
And anybody who's paying attention, which is probably why Microsoft is developing their own, but the fact that they're developing their own worries me because it means maybe Qualcomm doesn't have something in the roadmap, right? Remember when
they
Apple...
do have a history, though. I mean, if you're thinking about Xbox,
right?
They've done it before. They have, collaborated so tightly
True.
with somebody that you
and
might...
they did with the SQ1. They collaborated with Qualcomm, right? So, I mean, again, MediaTek plays in here to some extent because they make some of the best Chromebook chips, right? And
Right.
Chromebooks are important. They are very important education. They're
getting more and more important.
And they're very good at just being web devices. And if anything, COVID in 2020 has shown us the importance of Chromebooks. I mean, nobody's laughing at Chromebooks after 2020, I hope, because they've been the laughingstock. I've always been a believer from the cheap little $250 Lenovo, whatever it is that I have that runs a MediaTek chip that only has 4 gigs of RAM and always surprises me at how many tabs I can actually run on the thing. It's the Chromebook Duet from Lenovo. And from that all the way to the Pixel books and
That's right.
The fantastic Pixel Chromebooks that Google has given us.
Yeah.
So I'm a believer in the Chromebook, but again, I feel that MediaTek's doing some good work here in terms of bringing good compute performance to the masses that still doesn't feel too different than running Chrome on a PC. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge because Chrome is a pretty heavy duty thing on Intel, and looks like it runs much better on ARM ultimately. It's like now that there's an M1 version of Chrome for the Mac, Chrome is still a bit of a hog in terms of battery life, but it's so much better than it was on an Intel box.
And that was actually one of the biggest criticism on the Surface Pro X. The problem that Chrome was really draining your battery. But now also we have the updated version of the emulation for 64 bits on Surface.
Yeah,
yes.
we covered that last week, and I think that's going to help a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the other part, is also connectivity is going to be
critical.
And so that is where, you're looking at ARM and it's like, of course, because I've always been a big believer of connected PCs. And, even this year when people were not traveling, and it's not about traveling, it's about making sure you have enough connectivity, enough, throughput. When you have, 2 people working from home, a child, studying, but it's more gaming, to be honest with you, that drains my broadband. Connectivity is key.
It's critical. I think that one of the great positive stories out of 2020 for me is that the internet didn't break. I mean, It's designed not to break, but it really didn't break. And we taxed the crap out of it this year.
Yeah.
You think that we were kind to the internet? No. I hear a lot from my friends in IT how hard it has been for them to keep things up and running. But the fact that it's still up and running means that we're doing our jobs. And that's a little positive note to end the year. Speaking of positive notes, what is your favorite phone of 2020? And maybe even possibly your favorite tech product? It doesn't have to be a phone. Let me know what you have in store there.
So one phone we talked about, it was the Note 20 Ultra. I think that is one of the best devices that Samsung has ever made.
I agree.
It was just, from the camera to the improvement that they made on S Pen, it was just a really nice package altogether. And the other one is the iPhone 12 Pro Max. And those to me have been the standout of the year. On the mid-range side, the 4A is been one of my favorite on that more price point. And then from a technology overall, I'm going to say something that you don't think about it as technology, but the company clearly has become a tech company, and it's been my Peloton bike because I got to it late. I'm only on my 60th ride, but that has given me a lot of sanity, making me work out every day. And I even bought into part of the whole, trainers and community cycle, which is really not me. But there's a lot of good stuff that they're doing from a community aspect that I really appreciate.
Yeah, we were talking about that, Theo and I, yesterday. We were driving around and how we feel like Peloton, just one of the brands and the products that really stole the show in 2020, just like Zoom, actually.
Yes.
And there's others. For me, phones is really hard. I think my favorite affordable phone of 2020 is the Google Pixel 4a. I think in the $500 price point, my favorite is the OnePlus Nord, the original. And then the $700 price point, $750, is the Galaxy S20 Fan Edition, which we discussed. And my favorite in the $1,000 price point is the OnePlus 8 Pro, which is my daily driver, which I feel is the first uncompromised flagship that OnePlus has delivered. The camera on that phone are underrated and understated. Nobody talks about them, but they are phenomenal. And they're bespoke. And then we have, bespoke within the BBK group. The Finex 2 Pro shares the same main sensor and ultra wide. And then at the top, I would say that my favorite phone is like you, the Note 20 Ultra at the $1,200, whatever it is. I know it's discounted a lot, but it's still a super expensive. And that's why I have to break it down into these price brackets because the difference between the $350 Pixel 4a and that $1,200 or whatever Note 20 Ultra is ultimately not that huge in day-to-day use, except for the feature set, right? And the quality of the experience is pretty good on all of them. So that's kind of where I'm at in my favorites. My favorite camera phone, again, it's difficult because it's not really usable 100% as a phone, in my opinion. Is the P40 Pro Plus. I think that it really pushes the envelope in terms of imaging. And as we're seeing in the S21 Ultra, leaks are showing that Samsung has adopted that approach with the Ultra. So, I think 2021 is going to be a very interesting year in mobile, just like 2020 was. And I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to better coverage where I am for 5G and more cameras for sure.
Yes. Well, Carolina, we should wrap it up. Do you want to tell folks where they can find you on the internet, your various social media handles, and where you can be found with your articles?
Sure. I am on Twitter at Caro, Caro _ Milanesi, Milanesi. I write a column that is focused more on corporate social responsibility in tech and diversity and inclusion in tech for Forbes. And you can also find me on Techpinions with more kind of tech-centric topics and on Fast Company.
Yes, and you should definitely follow Caro on the Twitters and on her various writings. Good stuff. Folks, you know where to find me on the internet. I'm at Tankgirl, that's TNKGRL, on Twitter and on Instagram. It's like the comic book character Tankgirl, but you drop the vowels. And Twitter is where you want to go to comment on the show. If you want to discuss the show with me, ask me questions, whatever, this is a good vehicle for it because podcasting doesn't really support commenting very well. Instagram is where you'll find pretty pictures taken with phones and pretty pictures of the phones. And it's not just phones, all kinds of gadgets. I like smartwatches. Personal audio is another favorite of mine. So you'll see a lot of that. And then you know that there is a couple of YouTube channels that go along with this podcast. This is an audio show. So if you want some video to go along with the audio experience, want to see these phones we just talked about, the unboxings and stuff, I have videos. YouTube.com/MobileTechPodcast for the main channel. YouTube.com/MobileTechMore has additional stuff, especially like gadgety things that don't really fit into my core stuff. Please subscribe. We just created this channel pretty recently. We need more subscribers. And then, the podcast lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. So you can subscribe there through various links and RSS feed. But we're also on every major podcast app like Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, lots of places. Please consider, if your app lets you, your podcast app, rate the show or review the show. It really helps other listeners who are kind of finding us through the kind of discovery methods. And then if you can, there is a donate link in the show notes. The show notes are a collection of links to all the topics we discussed. And if you can support the podcast by making a donation, it's a PayPal link. It's pretty straightforward. Please consider that. And of course, I want to thank our sponsor, Audible. They've been with us since the very beginning, and they are fantastic. If you love books as much as I do, and you want to get them read to you instead of reading them with your tired 2020 eyes, consider joining Audible. We have a special deal for you, 30-day free trial with a book you get to keep at the end, whether you stay or not, and you help the podcast no matter what. But you should consider looking at Audible and sticking around. It is a really great platform. They have a ton of books. I love how books are read by their authors oftentimes, like the Obama book right now is read by Barack Obama himself. It's very cool. And then, there's some of these books take like 10 hours of listening or something, and it's like an epic thing. You really feel immersed. You feel like, I'm going to take a break now and dive into this 2 hours of this 10-hour epic thing. And it really feels like you can, like a good movie, get away from your troubles for a moment.
Especially right now.
Correct, exactly. So I think, check it out, click through, help yourself to that free trial. The link is audibletrial.com/mobiletech. That's audibletrial.com/mobiletech. Please consider clicking through, joining Audible, helping the podcast, helping Audible, who is a fantastic sponsor of us creators. So yeah. And Carolina, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I always love your chats and the knowledge that you can keep in your brain with all the price point, the specs and everything else, and the love that you have for mobile. You've been doing this for so long, but it feels like you're still looking at it with fresh eyes, which is nice.
I just love it. And I don't remember everything. And I get a lot of it wrong. Like sometimes I'm editing the podcast. I'm like, I'm going to remove that. That was the wrong price. But, sometimes I get it right. And if I don't, please let me know on Twitter, folks. We'll have another show next week, believe it or not. So stay tuned for that. Last show of 2020. Until then, cheers, everybody.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tank Girl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.